And greetings once again from Santiago, Chile. I'm Professor Bardale, and we're doing our series on the empiricists. So last time we talked about George Berkeley and his views of both idealism and phenomenalism. And I think if you look at the empiricists, it's good to sort of see a progression. So you look at how seriously do they take these empiricist principles. And as you'll recall, empiricism says that knowledge comes through the senses, the five senses, and all knowledge must be built from these raw materials. And the empiricists will say that rationalists, a priori principles, uh, uh, principles not derived through the senses are meaningless or invalid. So if you look at back to Locke, Locke is fairly common sense. Locke has this idea that there is a material world, uh, that there is a God, that you have a mind, that there are ideas, and these ideas represent the material world to your mind. And he has commonsensical ideas about cause and effect. Um, Locke's work actually laid the groundwork for modern science. He has this idea of atomic physics, these corpuscles, as he calls them, which are sort of like what we say are atoms today, these minute particles undetectable through the senses, but which cause our sensations. And so fairly common sense view, and kind of a modern empiricist. So remember, one of the things that Berkeley criticizes Locke about is his this idea of matter, the concept of matter or material substratum, or Locke calls it substance. So Locke says, well, we have all these sensations, and we can't imagine they're coming from nothing, or that the qualities of an object just sort of hang together with nothing sort of binding them and so we have this concept of a thing or an object. And and Locke says when we try to qualify what it is to say an object has substance or to say that it's real, we're sort of like children, or picking on the Indians, right? And he says it's sort of like a person from a less advanced culture with the kind of mythological explanation. And and so he says it's a something I know not what. Talking about this a guy in Indian from India who says, well, the world rests on the back of a broad-backed tortoise. And then when he's asked, well, what does a tortoise stand on? And he says, well, the tortoise stands on the back of a giant elephant, right? And it's like, oh, what's an elephant standing on? And he says, something I know not what, right? So that's the sort of idea, the something I know not what. It's kind of a metaphor for the concept of the real world or the material world or things having substance. But it's not an empiricist principle. It's something that you use to interpret your senses. It's an inference. It's an a priori principle. And remember, empiricists hate a priori principles. They say that they are invalid. They say somebody like Descartes, who thinks you can do philosophy as a series of syllogisms, is wrong, and that the cabinet of the mind is furnished by the materials of the senses. Right? Locke talks about us being a tabula rasa, a blank slate. We're born. We're not with innate ideas are a fantasy. There are no such things. Everything has to come from sensation. But yet Locke has this a priori principle of uh, the material world, of substance. And it's not a very, Locke's not being a very good empiricist when he says, well, we just can't imagine qualities existing without them existing in something. And so we suppose or posit a material world and a substance in which they exist, inhere, um, hold together, and so on. Okay, so Berkeley comes along and makes those exactly that point. It says, look, um, I'm going to just stick to the five senses. What does that mean? Well, it just means I have these experiences, and where's my direct experience of the material world? And he points out Locke has this idea of representationalism, this idea that ideas represent material objects to the mind, but why not just cut out the middleman and say God gives us the ideas directly? So Locke says a God created the world, and then the material world gives us these sensations through the perceptual apparatus that God's created in each of us. Um, and Berkeley says, well, where's the empirical evidence of the material world? And he points out that the material world really is an inference. It's an interpretation of experience. It's not an experience itself. So Locke will say that we experience the material world through the senses. So again, not directly. So this is the whole thing in Berkeley about the immediately versus immediately. So you perceive, and he gives the example of reading a book. So what you perceive are the letters. You don't really perceive the things the letters represent. So you don't directly perceive virtue. Say if it's a book about morality, you don't directly perceive God if it's a book of theology. So the Locke's representationalist model is you perceive colors and shapes and sizes and your sounds and have these tactile sensations, and then you infer that this represents this material world, which itself cannot be sensed directly. It can only be sensed indirectly or immediately as opposed to immediately. It can only be sensed indirectly through the five senses. So Berkeley points out there are all these paradoxes, like you can never really see a table. You see your idea of the table. And then Locke splits these things. There's like the physicalistic picture, the material picture, and then there's the representational idea picture. And so, what is sound? Sound is a vibration. What vibrations is something you feel. So he makes Locke say things like, well, you can never hear a sound, you can only feel it, and then light is a series of particles, so you can't see a thing, you can only feel it or something. So there's this paradox you get from the physicalistic picture versus the experiential picture, the material world picture versus the inner experience picture. And Berkeley says this is just nonsense. Just get rid of this idea of the material world. There's no evidence for it. And as an empiricist, you can't really say you believe in it because you can't experience it through the five senses. So Locke has a material world. He has God. He has minds. He has ideas. He has material cause and effect. With Berkeley, there's no material world. You still have God, and you still have minds and ideas, which ideas don't represent anything. They're just your experience. So there's minds having various experiences, which is described in terms of ideas. And ideas aren't just concepts. An idea, you can have idea of greenness. That's just having a sensation. So an idea is any mental thing. And both Locke and Berkeley use the term idea to describe experiencing a color, smelling a rose. All those are ideas. Both memories and what we would call sense experiences are all forms of ideas. And then Berkeley has a kind of cause and effect called willing or mental causation. So the way this works is you have an intention, like you want to raise your arm, and then your arm follows suit. So the way this works is you have an intention, and then God gives you the ideas based on the intention. Sometimes He doesn't always give you the ideas you want, but it's in reaction to your intention. So that's willing. So you have this idea of agency or mental causation. You form an intention, and then there's a change in your experience. So that's a kind of cause and effect. You come along to Hume. Hume gets rid of the material world. So he agrees with, and one way of looking at Hume is sort of like Berkeley without God and without minds. So no God, no souls, just ideas. And Hume strips away God and no cause and effect too. So Hume strips away all these things again on the basis of empiricist principles. So with Hume, there's no material world, there's no God, and there are no minds, and there's no cause and effect. It's just ideas and the association of ideas. And again, what can you prove based on your firsthand experience? What can you prove? And Hume basically says all you can prove is you have certain experiences and they seem to be associated in certain ways. One experience comes after the other. That's sort of how things go, but you can't prove anything beyond that. So, and Hume starts out with his talks about categorizing ideas in the same way Locke does. So Hume's terminology is a little different here. So he uses the word perception the same way Locke and Berkeley use ideas. So a perception is just any mental thing. It's not necessarily like a visual sensation, and it doesn't mean that you're perceiving a material object. A perception is just any mental thing, or you might say any and not even any experience, I suppose, unless you think about thinking about a concept as an experience. So it's anything that's in your mind or anything your mind is doing, that's a perception. So that's the general category. And then there's two kinds of perceptions. There's impressions and ideas. So impressions are, he calls them the vivid, lively ones, which are had passively, that aren't under our control, that are sort of forced on us, and are very detailed and clear. And then ideas are these faint, dull, vague, indistinct copies of impressions which we use in thinking. So his idea is that ideas are copied from impressions. So impressions are sort of the original. They're clear, they're lively, they're vivid, and they're forced on us. You can't not have a you can't avoid having an impression. An impression is something, and again, it's a passive experience. Impression is something that happens to you. It's not something you do. So, and then ideas are copies of impressions. So that's why they're not as clear, not as distinct. And those are things we do have control over. Now, normally you would say impressions are when you're having an experience of the external material world through the five senses, and then ideas are in your mind, and they're sort of abstracted from your experience. They represent this experience of the material world in your consciousness. So things like memory, imagination, abstract concepts, those are things that are just inside your mind. They're not part of the external world. They're not experience of the external world. But again, Hume says, well, what do you mean by external world? What do you mean by a material world? Can you prove such a thing exists based on your experience? And again, as an empiricist, you need to do that. And so Hume says, no, you don't. So Hume will say that you have these impressions, which are just all we'd say they're the vivid, lively ones that happen to you, and then there's ideas, the active ones that are under control, but are more faint and dull and vague, and are copies of the impressions. So we know where ideas come from. Ideas come from impressions. Where do the impressions come from? Hume says we don't know. Now, Locke would say impressions come from the material world. Berkeley says impressions come from God. Hume says big question mark. We don't know. So then Hume says, well, what are we left with? or just left with ideas and the association of ideas. So you'll see there's kind of this progression as you go from Locke, Berkeley to Hume. You have more extreme empiricism, more taking this principle seriously that all knowledge has to come from the five senses, getting rid of a priori principles. And as you get more empiricist, you end up getting more skeptical. Now, Berkeley says, I'm not really a skeptic, I'm common sense, blah, 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 but a normal interpretation of Berkeley is he's skeptical. He's skeptical about things that most people regard as common sense. So even though he disavows the term skeptic, most people would consider him to be one. So he's a skeptic in the sense that he's skeptical about the commonsensical ideas that most people have, even though Berkeley says, no, I'm Mr. Common Sense. So as you go towards more extreme empiricism, you also go towards more extreme skepticism. And Hume embraces the term skeptic. He says, "Yeah, I am a skeptic, and prove. I'll believe anything I can prove, but what can you really prove?" And so, more empiricism, more questioning of common sense, more skepticism. Which seems sort of weird because most people associate empiricism with common sense. But as you look in Berkeley and Hume, that's not the case. If you take empiricism to its extremes, or maybe to put a better way, to take it seriously as a principle you're going to follow closely, then you end up with these sort of strange anti-common sense views where you can't prove there's a material world, you can't believe that you have a mind, you can't believe in cause and effect, and so on. So let's see, let's get to Hume has this mantra. It's he says, whenever you have a principle, you should ask yourself, from what impression is the supposed idea derived? So anytime somebody suggests something, you say, well, if you have an idea, it has to be traceable back to one or more sensory impressions. So he'll say, and again, just talk about cause and effect. Let's just start out with that. Well, first of all, the material world, right? So from what you have this concept of matter, and Hume pretty much agrees with Berkeley that the material world can't be experienced directly. It's sort of a posit or an interpretation of experience, but it is not itself traceable to any particular experience. It's a way of trying to make sense of our experience. Again, you can't, as an empiricist, say, well, okay, I have all these experiences, how do I make sense of them? That's like thinking like a rationalist when you're thinking about, I'm going to decide what's true or false based on what makes sense, what seems reasonable or logical. I'm going to have this interpretation which goes beyond the sense data. That, again, that's a rationalist way of thinking. The empiricist says that everything has to be traceable back to sense experience. So then when you look at cause and effect, Hume says, ask yourself, from what impression is this supposed idea of cause and effect derived? So first he analyzes the concept of cause and effect, like what is it, right? So think about like you're playing a game of billiards, right? It's sort of like pool, and you hit the cue ball and with the stick, and it knocks into another ball and makes a clacking sound, and the other ball goes off in some direction based on where you hit the ball. So he says, first of all, you have in cause and effect, you have priority and time. So A happens, then B happens. So never, for example, you don't hear the clacking noise before the balls hit, right? The balls hit each other, and then you hear the clacking noise, and then the other ball goes off in some direction. So the cause must always precede the effect. Okay. The second thing is contiguity. So suppose you miss the shot, right? The cue ball doesn't hit the other ball. Well, then there's no clacking noise. The other ball doesn't move. So contiguity just means that for one object to causally affect another, they have to touch. Now, what about affecting something through a distance? And I think Hume would say, well, there's forces, and like the wind can blow things, and there might be um, um, affect the object at a distance. I think he would say that it's still you have to have two things coming into contact. I don't know what he'd say about sort of air molecules, because that's kind of material world stuff. But he would say, in your ordinary experience, like in order for the baseball to break the window, it has to touch the window first, right? So you have to have physical, I'm going to say physical contact. The objects have to touch. So see how it's very difficult to not lapse into material object talk when talking about our experience. So the third thing, though, is this necessary connection. Again, he's trying to analyze the concept of cause and effect. What do most people mean when they're talking about cause and effect? And Hume says that there's this necessary connection in the sense that there's this idea that if A happens, B has to happen. Or to put it another way, um, if A happens, it's impossible for B not to happen. So this idea of the necessity and causation, or the mustness, where you think that something else, it's not like that it will probably happen, or that it might happen, or even that it will happen, it's got to happen. And that's this idea of necessary connection between cause and effect, and this mustness. So, and Hume says, is this really in our experience? And is this something we actually observe? So, and Hume says, if you think about the necessary connection between cause and effect, necessity isn't something you can observe. So you can observe that whenever A happens, B happens, and it's always happened in the past. But how do you know it's going to happen in the future? How do you know that when you hit that billiard ball just right, that it's going to go into the pocket, or even that it's going to move, or it's going to make that clacking sound? And Hume says you don't. And then he makes this case of the necessity. How do you what is necessity? Well, this idea that something's got to be a certain way, and he says necessity means that you can't imagine it being otherwise. So we think about mathematics as being necessary. So mathematical truths are necessary truths. 2 and 2 is 4, and that's a necessary truth because you can't imagine it being 5 or 12 or 19, right? It's got to be 4. Or you think about a thing can't be its opposite. It's not that most of the time it's not its opposite. You think that it's impossible for a thing to be its opposite. Or it's impossible for something to be both true and false in the same way, in the same respect. So logic and mathematics, those are necessary truths because we can't imagine them being otherwise. A triangle has 3 sides is a necessary truth because you can't picture in your mind a 4-sided triangle, right? So that which is imaginable is possible in the broadest sense. So this idea of necessity has to do with what's imaginable and not imaginable. Okay, now he says, can you imagine the cause without its usual effect? And Hume says, sure. You could imagine, the billiard ball hitting the billiard ball and the second billiard ball just sitting there, not moving, not making a sound or anything. You can imagine it disappearing, right? You can picture it in your mind. You can imagine the second billiard ball jumping off the table or spinning in the air. Right? You can imagine all kinds of crazy things that violate the so-called laws of cause and effect. We see this in our fiction, right? You can imagine a man jumping out of a building, and instead of plummeting to his death via the law of gravity, you can imagine him flying through the air like Superman, right? Or you can imagine all sort of things like Harry Potter and magic and people shooting electricity bolts out their fingers and all kinds of things that aren't possible in the material world, or aren't the sort of things that are out of the range of your experience that don't happen, but you can picture them in your mind. So they're possible in the broadest logical sense. So they're not necessary. So because you can imagine something different happening, the thing that happens doesn't have to happen. And if that's the case, then there's no necessary connection between cause and effect. So what is the connection between cause and effect? And where does this idea of necessity come from? Well, Hume says, since you're not observing the necessity must be in you. You have this expectation that B's got to happen. So the necessity isn't something you can observe, but it's an expectation you have. And Hume just says that nature has accustomed you to expect B to happen when A happens. So it's a form of psychological conditioning. So see A happens and B happens. See A happens, B happens. A, B, A, B, A, B. You see A, you say B. B's going to happen. And after a while, you see it happening enough, you think, well, B's got to happen. It's always happened in the past. It's going to happen in the future. And it's part of, he says, human nature. It's a form, again, of psychological conditioning, and it's just part of the way our mind works that when you see this constant conjunction of objects, when in your experience one thing follows another over and over and over again, you're like Pavlov's dog. You expect B to happen when A's happen. So, Pavlov's dog, he would ring a bell and bring food, ring a bell and bring food, ring a bell and bring food. And then you ring the bell, and the dog's looking around, it's salivating, it's expecting the food to come. And Hume says, cause and effect is sort of like that. He doesn't use that example. Pavlov came later. But Hume would say, we're like that dog. We're salivating, waiting for that clacking noise. We're waiting for that billiard ball to move along. And that expectation is something that's in our minds. It's not something in reality. It's something that necessity is in us. And it's about one way of putting it is the necessity of cause and effects all in your mind. Now, as it turns out, Hume says your mind doesn't exist, but we'll get to that later. But speaking conventionally, Hume will say that the cause and effects all in your mind. That there's this concept, and it's an invalid concept. So now, empirically, again, what can you verify? There's three components to cause and effect. You can verify the first one. You can see, okay, well, whenever A happens, B happens. That's something you can observe, right? That the cause never precedes the effect. You can also verify, through your senses, the contiguity. The objects they have to touch, or the objects do touch. They have to touch. That's have to in terms of like to fit the concept. So it's not talking about, they're not talking about the necessity and cause and effect. So I don't want to confuse you here. So you can observe that one thing happens before another. You can observe that two objects touch, but you can't observe necessity. Necessity is a logical relationship. It's not an empirical one. And again, Hume would say, is a sort of a priori concept, but no a priori concepts in empiricism. So you basic logic and mathematics. So, and I shouldn't say no a priori concepts. So Hume will accept that there are logical relationships, and that they're I think he thinks they're learned through abstraction. They come ultimately through experience, but he does understand there are a priori concepts. Like logic and mathematics. But he asked, is cause and effect one of these things? And he says, no, cause and effect has to do with objects, and it has to do with objects observed through the five senses. So there are logical relations, or relations of ideas, and then there are things that have to do with the senses, which are about matters of fact. And never the twain shall meet. And so you can say it's a necessary truth that a triangle has three sides, but it's not a necessary truth that when you throw a baseball at a window, it's going to break. That's an expectation, it's a prediction, it's a belief you have, but there's no logical reason why it should, or you can't prove that it will. You can show that it has in the past. You can say you expect it to happen in the future. You can say you strongly expect it, that you think it has to happen, but that's just an expectation on your part. It's not proof. So how do we know the patterns in the past will continue in the future? And Hume says you can't because you have no justification for believing that. All you can say is, well, something happened in the past that makes me expect to happen in the future. But that's not a reason. That's not a logical reason. And again, that necessity, that mustness, that's not something you can observe. So therefore, he assumes that where can it come from? Well, it's coming from you. It's your expectation that you're projecting onto your experience. So you experience one thing and you expect another thing to happen. Okay, so the necessity and cause and effect is all in your mind. It's caused through psychological conditioning. You think about, well, that seems like kind of a nutty view. What about like scientific laws? Well, but what is a scientific law really? Isn't it just a generalization of our experience? Doesn't it say, well, here's a scientific law is like, here's what we observe, and here's a theory that sort of puts all experiences together. Here's what's always happened in the past. And then you assume a priori that patterns in the past will continue in the future. And so you call it a law. But really, it's just a generalization for our experience, right? We make a bunch of observations, and then we come up with theory that says whenever this thing happens, right? When you smash these particles together, here's what you get. And here's a story about why that happens, but it's really just a generalization. That gravity says heavy objects and will fall to the ground. It's a generalization. And maybe you can describe it in mathematical terms, but that just describes the rate of fall and the conditions on which things will happen a certain way. It still ultimately comes back to these observations we make. Okay, let's see. So Hume says we can be no more sure that the sun will rise tomorrow than that it won't, which is kind of a strange thing to say. Again, very not common sense at all, right? You think, well, one thing I'm sure of is the sun's going to rise tomorrow. And Hume says you're just sort of guessing. You have this expectation it's going to happen, but how do you know that patterns in the past will continue in the future? How can you justify that via the senses? And Hume will say, well, you really can't do that. That all you can say is that you've had these experiences in the past, and you expect them to continue in the future. Well, what about the material world? Isn't the material world based on cause and effect? Well, where is your proof of the material world? All you can say is you have these sensations, right? And what are the sensations? Well, you have the impression, like you're looking at a tree and you can kind of see the patterns in the bark, and you can see the leaves, and if it's a pine tree, you can count the needles, and you can see how tall it is. And then when you think about that tree later, you have an idea of the tree, and it's kind of faint and hazy, and you can't really think about what the pattern of the bark really looked like, and you're not sure whether how many needles in a bundle, and it's sort of faint and hazy and not distinct. But you can kind of control it. You can imagine the tree being blue instead of being green. You can imagine it being, as 500 feet tall, or you can imagine it being like a little tiny tree, right? You can kind of manipulate and control it. Whereas when you're looking at the tree and having an impression of the tree, you can't really control it, but it's super vivid and lively, and it kind of forces itself on you. It's a passive experience. And Hume says that's all you can say. You have impressions, you have ideas which seem to be copies of the impressions, and so then you, as an empiricist, you ask yourself, well, what set of impressions does this idea come from? And with the cause and effect, it comes from the priority in time, the contiguity. But if the necessity, which is an essential component of cause and effect, if that can't be verified or validated through some either a particular impression or some series of impressions, then get rid of it. And Hume says he recognizes the revolutionary import of his view. He says, convinces these principles, what havoc must we wreak when we run over the libraries, pick up a volume? Is it a book of logic and mathematics? No. Is it a book of based on observations of the empirical observations, a book of science, or again, based on observations? No. And then he says, consign it to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And he's probably thinking about theological books and some other books of sort of maybe I wouldn't say books on morality, but maybe books on morality based on a priori principles. But a lot of this, I think he's thinking of as sort of books on theology. Um, but Hume will say, if you can't observe it firsthand, if you can't experience it, it's an illusion. You're fooling yourself. It's a fantasy. And this is really based on what can you know? What can you really prove? All you can prove is you have these certain kinds of sensations, um, and some seem to be related to others. And so Hume says, what are you left with? Well, you're left with ideas and relations of ideas. So where do all these ideas exist then? So Berkeley still has minds, right? And he makes this distinction between, willing, which is the ideas which you kind of give yourself indirectly through, you have an intention and God gives you the ideas, but they seem to be under your control. And then there's, what Hume would call impressions, which are kind of forced on you. And Berkeley has this distinction too. Hume says, but Berkeley has a kind of idea that there's this mental causation, that there's cause and effect in terms of willing. So I do a certain thing and then I get a certain result. I form an intention, I perform an action. It's all ideas, but I'm performing an action in the idea world, and I get a result. Hume says there's no such thing as mental causation. Now, he talks about having control over your ideas, but really it's you form an intention and then you get certain ideas, but the one doesn't cause the other. So Berkeley would say there's cause and effect in the sense that you do something and then something happens as a result. And it's that God gives you the ideas based on your intentions and sets up this sort of world of mental cause and effect. Now God's kind of micromanaging it, so he's doing it each time. But it's something like cause and effect. Hume says all you know is that you have that ideas seem related to each other in certain ways. So there's no cause and effect at all, and there's no mental causation because there are no minds. Now, what does Hume mean when he says there's no such thing as the mind? Well, again, based on empirical principles, do you have an experience of your own mind? And Hume would say, well, you have this kind of vague idea of the mind's like a theater, where successive ideas make their appearance and glide away. So you have this idea, you have a sort of the mind's kind of like a stage, and idea, one comes along, makes its appearance, and then exits. It says his bit part and then exits. Sir, the prisoners have escaped, right? Takes off, right? And the king says, go find them. And the guy has offstage left. And that's like, oh, I'm hungry. And then, oh, look, a new cat video. And then all of a sudden you're distracted. You forget about the hunger. The hunger idea goes away. And now you're getting ideas of the cat video. And that's, in your mind. And then the phone rings. And all of a sudden you're thinking about something else. So all these different ideas play out in your mind, and they come and go. But the idea of, but when he says, when I think about myself, I always hit on some perception, right? So you look inside your mind, you're like, me. Well, I'm hungry. I'm trying to figure out how to change Chilean pesos to dollars at the best exchange rate. I'm I'm having sensation of delicious coffee. Uh, you know, I'm enjoying the balmy weather, right? So I feel warm and comfortable. And so all these are sensations you're having. They're ideas you're thinking about. But then where does all this stuff go on? And he says, well, whenever I try to find myself, I can never catch myself without a perception. So when I kind of peer inside my own mind, kind of think about what's there, I always hit on some perception and I never find myself. And all I find is the perception. So he says, I never catch myself without a perception. And when I peer into my own mind, all I find is perceptions. So therefore, all I am is a bundle of perceptions. So he thinks about the mind as this kind of network of perceptions that are associated in certain ways. And, it's sort of a cluster of perceptions, like a cluster of grapes. Or maybe you might think about it as being like a circle of marbles, right? Marbles come in, marbles go out. But it's just a sort of bundle of perceptions which seem to be associated in a certain way. And so that's what Hume would call a mind. He says, now, the mind has no substance. It's not like a thing. It's just the name for a collection. So thinking about like, do collections of things really exist? Um, does an army exist? Well, in a sense, in that there are soldiers united for a common purpose and institution. But what really exists? What really exists are the individual soldiers. And then we have this conventional term for a group of soldiers we call an army. But an army has no independent substance or existence apart from the particular soldiers. So in the same way, the mind has no substance, it has no existence apart from the particular ideas which compose it. So, and now how can Hume say the mind is X and the mind doesn't exist? Because you say, if you define it and say it is something, how can you deny its existence? So, I think the best way to think about this is you think about like God, right? So, to say God doesn't, you can say God doesn't exist, or you could say God is a projection of a father figure. And you can say both those things at the same time. Or you could say God is a social construct. So when you say God doesn't exist, what you mean is there is no being which has substance or existence, independent of people's minds. So when you say God is a projection of a father figure or a social construct, what you mean is there is no literal or actual God, but there is an explanation as to why people have the idea of God, and God is this phenomena explicable in terms of other things that do exist. So in the same way, Hume will say there is no such thing as a mind in the sense of a substance, as Descartes would say, an immaterial substance, a soul, or even a brain, right? Because that's material object talk. So there is no such thing as a mind. They're just ideas and the association of ideas, or there's just perceptions. So you could say both the mind doesn't exist as a substantial object or as something which has continuity through time, which persists through time as an independent object, that there is no such thing as a substantial self or mind, and that the mind doesn't exist. That the mind doesn't exist, which means there's no substantial self or mind which exists independently of anything else. You can say that, and you can say the mind is just a bundle of perceptions. And maybe another similarity, you could say, someone is just a fictional character, right? Sherlock Holmes uh, smokes a pipe, and Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, right? You can say both those things. So Hume will say there is no such thing as the mind in the sense of an independently existing thing, something with substance, something which persists through time, something which has the perceptions. That doesn't exist. But then, why do people talk about the mind? Why do people believe in the mind? Well, the mind is just a term we use for this bundle of perceptions. So what is the mind? Really, it's just this bundle of perceptions. It doesn't have any identity in that there's no real self, and there's no identity through time. So the you know perceptions come and go. And so there's no thing I can call myself apart from the individual perceptions that come and go. So there's no identity through time where you can say it's the same mind it was yesterday or the day before, because all the perceptions might be different. There might be a few that are the same, but eventually you're going to get to a point where there's no perceptions when you go to sleep, and then there's going to be different perceptions the next day. It might be maybe a pattern of perceptions, but there's no one perception which follows you through your entire life, so there's no real identity, right? It, if the perceptions of the mind continually change, it's no sense of saying it's the same mind it was yesterday. So there's no, and part of this concept of the self as an object which persists through time, um, and has identity over time. And Hume says no such thing. So now, what about this bundling? What does it mean to say I'm a bundle of perceptions? Why can't I? Why do we have different experiences? So I can't experience what you're experiencing, right? So I hit my excuse me a minute. So look at this. My thumb is numb. You can see that because I've been holding the phone very tightly, right? So why aren't you feeling that? Why aren't you feeling that sensation of numbness and soreness? Why don't you have that experience? Well, it's because you're a different bundle. Now, what is this bundling? Normally, we would say like we have different minds or different nervous systems. Hume can't say that, right? No material world, no disembodied minds like Berkeley. So what do you got? Well, Hume will just say, well, we don't know. All we know is like the bundling is that, you have certain experiences that I don't have. I have certain experiences that you don't have. I can't peer into your bundle. You can't peer into my bundle. Our bundles aren't associated. But that's all we can say is that my bundle is different from your bundle. And that's what we call a mind. The reason we have this concept of mind at all is because of this, that we have individual experiences, that I experience some things you can't experience, you experience some things I can't experience. But that doesn't mean there's a substantial self or there's an individual mind. It just means there's different bundles. Now, why are ideas bundled in these different packages? Why are they clustered in different ways? And again, Hume says, well, I don't know. That's just the way it is. Um, so, okay, so no God, no minds, no cause and effect. So it starts to get pretty weird, right? And you go, well, why would anybody believe this? It just seems crazy. It seems like we're not even back to Descartes, right? Maybe we are. Maybe we're back to I think therefore I am. Let's come back to that for a minute. What would Hume say about that? Well, Hume would say, I think therefore I am. So what am I? Descartes follows that with what am I? I'm a thinking thing, or a thing which thinks. Hume would say, what do you mean by thing? This concept of a subject or a substantial self is really something that goes beyond your experience. All you can say is there's thinking going on, right? Where do you get thinking thing? A thing, the concept of a thing or a substance, even an immaterial substance, implies identity through time. It implies something which has independent existence. And Hume says you really don't have any concept of that at all. All you have is the experience of ideas, but you have no concept of what's experiencing the ideas. And this idea of a whatness or a who, which is having the ideas, Hume says it could be an illusion. And again, when you don't have this concept of, okay, well, there's like I have an experience of myself, and then I have an experience of myself having ideas. You only have experience of the ideas, right? You don't experience yourself having ideas, you experience the ideas. And then Hume would say, you make this inference that, well, somebody's got to be having the ideas, that must be me, right? If the arch deceiver is fooling me, then somebody must be fooled. And I have to exist at least as an object of the arch deceiver's evil scheme. But Hume would say even this concept of I or me, there's no, how do you verify that in your experience? All your experience shows you is I'm feeling hot, I'm feeling cold, my thumb is numb, um, I'm thinking about this thing that happened a long time ago, I'm having a memory impression, I'm perceiving something, the sense of I'm having a vivid, lively impression, or maybe I'm experiencing this faint copy of the impression. And so all of this is sort of what we think about as being our everyday common sense experience. Where does it take place? And Hume says we don't have any positive concept of this. So what are we left with? Well, again, Hume will say there's ideas and the association of ideas. We have perceptions, and those fall into the categories of impressions, which are the vivid, lively ones, and the ideas, which are the faint copies, and where the impressions come from, well, we don't know. Where did the impressions and ideas occur? We don't know. We have this sort of vague idea of a stage or a container of ideas, but there's no impression. There's no sensory impression or experience of the container. So we can't believe in such a thing. And from what impression is a supposed idea derived? If you can't find the original impression that the idea is supposedly copied from, it's an illusion. It doesn't exist. You can't say it exists. Again, Hume is taking empiricism to its furthest extent. He's this kind of extreme empiricist. Or again, to say extreme, I suppose, in these days, it sort of has this negative connotations. He takes, maybe a better way of saying it is he takes empiricism to its logical conclusion. And Kant's going to come along and say, although he credits Hume for waking him from his dogmatic slumbers, and Hume sort of shook up Kant, who started out as a rationalist like Descartes. So even though Kant credits Hume, he says, if you take empiricism to its logical conclusion, you end up with an absurdity. So rather than embrace the absurdity, maybe there's something wrong with empiricism. And so Kant sort of dials things back, and you get something that's not quite like Locke, but it's someplace in between, which says that maybe there are certain things we can't prove directly, but maybe we can prove them indirectly. And we can say that certain a priori truths must obtain to make sense of our experience. And that's okay. We can say that we want our ideas to make sense. We want a logical explanation for why things are the way they are. If we go whole hog empiricist with no a priori principles, we end up with absurd conclusions. So we want to avoid those, and that's perfectly okay. That's what philosophy is all about, is coming up with an interpretation of the world that makes sense. And Kant has this idea there are certain preconditions of our experience which must obtain in order for us to even have experience. And that's these sort of a priori principles. And he'll say it's things like cause and effect, that the idea of the concept of the mind, the thinking subject, and of the material world. Although he'll agree with the other empiricists that we don't, Berkeley and Hume, we don't experience it directly, and that it's not a what you see is what you get sort of thing. We have experiences, but we can never really know what the world in itself is. We can only know the world as we experience it. But that's jumping a little ahead to get to Kant. But I'm mentioning this because one way of looking at Hume is being kind of a proto-Kantian. So what does proto mean? It's sort of a forerunner, a person who has a view before it really comes out in the world of ideas. And so Hume, asks this question, what can you really prove? And what can you really prove via the senses? And as a philosopher, Hume wants to say that you shouldn't give assent to anything you can't prove, and all proof must come through the senses. And so, Hume says, when I walk out of my study after doing some philosophy, I believe in cause and effect just like the next guy. If there's a runaway coach coming down the street, I'm going to jump out of the way. Um, if I see if I see someone drop a vase, I cringe and wait for that telltale shattering sound. In the restaurant here, somebody dropped a glass dish as a dessert dish, and I saw it fall, and oh, it's gonna fall, and I heard the shattering sound. And he would say, well, that happens to me too. It's custom, it's nature, it's unavoidable. Um, I'm just like everybody else. That's the way I operate. But when I'm a philosopher, I'm not going on common sense. I'm not going on what I expect or even what human nature has habituated me into believing. I'm trying to go on what I can prove. And based on what I can prove, all I can say is I have certain kinds of experiences that seem related in certain ways. And um, and if I can't prove it, I shouldn't believe it philosophically. Now, Hume says, in spite of myself, I'm going to find myself believing all the things everybody else believes. But when I, close my study door and I'm being a philosopher, I'm trying to be logical, analytical, stick with what I can prove, and I just throw up my hands and say, well, I have certain experiences, they seem related in certain ways, and that's all I can say. And I think Kant will say that based on experience, Hume is right. That if you just try to prove things based on the five senses, you can only get so far. But Kant says it's okay to have some a priori principles. And if you do that, things really make a lot more sense. And I think where Kant and Hume disagree is on what can be, whether how legitimate it is to bring in these a priori principles. And Hume says, this is Descartes. You can't do philosophy a priori. There's a few things like logic and mathematics, but you have those in experience, and there's this big disconnect between relations of ideas and matters of fact. The relations of ideas can just tell you how ideas are related to each other, but in order to understand the world, the world of experience, you have to use the five senses. And Kant's going to disagree with this and kind of mix things up a little bit, which we'll talk about next time. Maybe to conclude here, let's see if I can show you the bit of San Diego outside my window here. Let's see. A couple minutes left, so maybe I'll try to show you a little more as I go on my trip. Beautiful city. Staying at the Courtyard Marriott here. See very modern skyscrapers. Traffic's fairly light at this time of the day. It's a Sunday, though. Lots of hustle and bustle in the city. It's a modern metropolis. Let's see if I can show the mountains there. You can show you some better vistas later on. If I try to put myself in front of the vista, I'm going to be all blacked out because of the way cameras work. Photography tip, don't shoot your pictures like this, or the background is going to be washed out and the foreground is going to be all dark. So you're going to need some reflectors, or you want to stand off to the side or something like that. It's tricky. Photography can be tricky. Let's see. I'll give you a better view here of the city. So that's it for Hume. We're going to do another day on Hume, and I'll talk a bit about him, and maybe skip ahead to Kant and talk about, there we go, talk about his relationship to Kant here. And let's see, there we go. So feel free to send me a middle message if you have any questions. I'll be available during my regular office hours. I'll be doing a bit of traveling down south to take care of some things to other parts of Chile. So I'm checking out the Marriott today in Santiago. I'm going to try to be there in the evening. As I've mentioned before, Scheduling here is kind of weird. People do business late into the evening, but I'll make every endeavor to be there, and I'll get back to you just as soon as I can if you send me a little message. Adios, and talk to you next time.